doing Sunday school, and she should be here soon.
Oh, okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And
Morning.
welcome. We did not read the preceding passage, which is the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit, because we already have so much of that in our world today. When we say, just notice all the problems and challenges and difficulties that we are going through right now, in this country alone. All the problems and how we are dealing with immigrants, how we are dealing with displaced people, how we are dealing with LGBT community, how we are dealing with the black community, and how we are dealing with one another as a whole, is basically what prompted me to focus our reflection this morning on perhaps we all need grace at this point. Grace as it is shown to us and as we feel it in the forms of the fruit of the Spirit. I would like to begin our meditation this morning with a simple question. What comes to mind when you hear of the word grace? What is grace in Spanish? Is it gracia? Gracia. Okay. What comes to mind when we hear of the word grace? We seldom talk about grace. We always talk about justice. We always talk about peace. We always talk about other things. But grace, we don't talk about grace that much. What comes to mind when you hear of the word grace? Blessing. What else? Forgiveness.
Unmerited favor.
Unmerited favor. Okay? Something that is given to someone who is undeserving. Otherwise, it ceases to be grace. Right? If I give you something because you deserve it, then I wouldn't call it grace.
It's pay.
It's a payback time. It's a way of acknowledgement. It's to recognize, But grace is given to someone who undeserves that, whatever that is, it's given to us. And then, how have we been experiencing God's grace? Every day. In his book, and by the way, I have shared this story with Wellspring before, but its message is relevant, remains to be relevant to our reflection this morning. There was a story in Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace? He told of a story of a person named Peter Grieve, who wrote a memoir of his life with leprosy, a disease he contracted while stationed in India. He returned to England half blind and partially paralyzed to live in a compound run by a group of Anglican sisters. Because of his physical condition, Peter was unable to work, and people did not want to associate with him. When you have leprosy, that's something that people kind of, don't want to get closer to you. In fact, in the Philippines, many years ago, there was a particular island somewhere in Palawan called Coron, where all Filipinos who were affected by leprosy were brought together. So that is a form of, call it discrimination in the name of protecting the entire country. So the entire island was literally inhabited by Filipinos who had contracted leprosy. And so this made Peter become Peter. He even thought of suicide. And so he made elaborate plans to escape the compound, but always backed out because he had nowhere to go. One morning, uncharacteristically, Peter got up very early and then walked around the ground. Hearing a buzzing noise, he followed it to the chapel, where sisters were praying for the patients whose names were written on its walls. Among the names, he found his own. Somehow that experience of connection, of linking, changed the course of Peter's life. That morning, for the first time, he felt wanted. He felt graced. We are using grace here as a verb. He felt graced. The story of Peter Green reminds us of some aspects in our worship service where we come, not only because we are invited to do so, but because we have this inner desire to belong. I hope this is true to all of us. According to John Buertes, who used to teach at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, to belong is a basic human need that for many is non-negotiable. I wonder if there is anybody among us here who doesn't have the need to belong. In other words, to be a part of something big. It is this need to connect, to be in communion with Christ, together with the rest of our brothers and sisters. This human need to belong is basic if someone wants to find meaning in life and purpose of his or her existence. Life in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, where Christ extends to each one of us an extravagant welcome and invite to come, eat, and drink, which actually fulfills that inner human desire, welcome, welcome, that inner human desire to become a part of a fellowship, and which culminates in the actual partaking of the elements. Within the context of the Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper, for example, Christ's invitation to partake, despite our unworthiness, demonstrates God's grace in its highest degree. Grace is God's undying love and utmost care extended to us despite our unworthiness. Okay. So now some are going to their Sunday school class. And like Peter Green in our story, hopefully this grace that we receive will have ripple effects. Not only within ourselves, but that we also become a vessel whereby the fruit of the Spirit overflows unto others and the world will live in. And then everybody experiences grace. In a world that is dominated by wars, violent and armed conflict, hunger, homelessness, and other forms of dehumanization, like the immigration problem we are having here in the United States, where families fleeing violence in most Central American countries, where families are being separated and the children are literally being incarcerated. We have a witness here, right? Jose Luis,
Yeah.
before you family became together, you were separated.
Yeah.
And by the way, last month I shared this particular immigration problem we have here in the Philippines. And after the worship service, so after the sermon, everybody, people applauded my sermon. But then as I walked down the aisle, there was one Filipino who's been living here in the United States, who right away said to me, "I totally disagree with what you said. What you said is not true. Families are not separated. Children." And I said, and then we have spent millions of money dealing with immigration. I said, so? But it was difficult. There's no point to converse with a person. No. This Filipino, and this is another problem. Because sometimes the problem may be right in front of us and still we don't see it through the lens of a problem. We still see it as something else. Even though the problem is right in front of us and still we refuse to see it as a problem, like the immigration, how much our immigration program here needs reform. The issue of racism still is very deeply rooted here in this country. Xenophobia, for those of us who have heard political rhetoric of our very own leaders, I'm sorry, I don't know where in the political spectrum you stand, But in the last week, people who are fleeing, who have been displaced in Bahamas because of Hurricane Dorian, they are already being categorized as gangsters, as terrible, as bad. Something we don't want to welcome here because they might just create problem before these displaced communities could even started their trip to wherever they want to be resettled or relocated. They are already being boxed. Biases against, prejudices towards. And sometimes we ask ourselves the question, where does this hatred come from? Where does this animosity come from? Aren't we experiencing grace that we don't know how to extend this to others? And sometimes I ask myself the question, is there a room for grace in politics? To bring and share this grace with others by way of the fruit of the Spirit is, I believe, one of our great challenges as Christians. God continues to call each one of us to become bearers of grace so that the world that has not known nor experienced grace, or the world that may have already forgotten what grace is for a long time now, may be reminded that hope still illumines, that life is still more powerful than death, and that love is still stronger than hate. This was part of the context that made St. Paul write his letter to the Galatians. There were internal tensions within and among Christians during that time, compounded by outside triggers brought about by the socio-cultural and political climate that they were living in. In Galatians, for example, Paul's direct and confrontational personality clearly comes out, especially in chapter 2, where he confronts Peter in Antioch over the Judaizers. There was a significant group during his time in Galatians known as the Judaizers in early Christianity, who felt that Christian converts had to observe the Jewish law as well as follow the teachings of Christ. In other words, there was this group who still believed that we are still bound by the law, even though Paul has already been telling them about the grace that frees us from this law. And so that created tension within Christian communities. In fact, the same problem was experienced by the Christian church in Corinth. There were so much cliques and divisions. Some of the Christians said, we are followers of Cephas. Others said, we are followers of Apollos. Others said, we are loyalists of Paul. And then some would say, we are for Christ. These were the Christians. And then Paul said, is Christ divided? This was the context in which Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians. The Greek word translated here as quarrel can also mean argument or strife. And Paul uses the same word again in the 3rd chapter of his letter. For as long as there is jealous and quarreling among you, you are not. Aren't you of the flesh? And he contrasted this with the fruit of the Spirit. The Corinthian church and the Galatian church were being torn apart, not by one single controversy, but by multiple conflicts and tensions. And again, this was the context by which the mention of the fruit of the Spirit in Paul's letter to the Galatians find its meaning and significance. Within the context of so much polarization and divides, where members of the same Christian community or faith community become part of different cliques within. it becomes difficult to feel the oneness and unity of God and experience the fruit of the Spirit through its members. Can you really feel God in a church, within a church, where members are quarreling against each other? Where there is so much tension? We're not talking here about uniformity or sameness. Because disagreements and differing views are a healthy part of any dynamic relationship. We are talking about people becoming polarized, us versus them narrative. It's hard to see and feel God in this context, in this community. Grace ought to be integrated into the individual and collective life of that community. It was when Peter grieved in our story felt grace. That is, when he realized that people around him were actually praying for him, that he felt affirmed and loved. And this facilitated his becoming more open and engaging with others once again. And I think this was the challenge of Paul to the Christians in Galatians, including the Christians in Corinth. Let grace envelop us. The fruit of the Spirit, namely love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, are all thought of as one. In other words, they comprise a rich variety or forms of grace, of conduct and character. If you notice, the reading did not say the fruits of the Spirit. It says the fruit of the Spirit. In other words, the individual members are not isolated graces, but all connected, springing from one root and constituting an organic whole, whereas the works of the flesh have no such unity and are not worthy of being called fruit. Given the conflicts and tensions that the Christians in Galatians were going through, such fruit of the Spirit was just what they needed. Such a variety of graces, therefore, can never be compartmentalized. In other words, you cannot say, oh, I just want to live out and exemplify peace and kindness and forget about the rest. Nor can you say, oh, I will just want to possess goodness and faithfulness and I don't need and I don't care about the rest. No. Because, in fact, when we all experience grace, fruit bearing will come naturally. And the people around us can see it. Fruit bearing comes naturally because no law goes against it. It happens when we simply allow the fruit to grow by abiding in Christ. When we are blessed with this fruit of the Spirit, we also become a blessing to others. And so in a world and in a country like the United States that perhaps has already forgotten the presence of grace, this is our ongoing call as faith communities to live out this fruit of the Spirit. Many might even also want to partake of the fruit that emanates through us. This was one reason why Paul admonished the early Christians to live out the fruit of the Spirit so that others are also able to partake of it, thereby lessening the exacerbation of the conflicts. I always remind people and communities that I happen to work with in different contexts around the world that conflict is normal. We all know that. Tensions are normal. Disagreements are a healthy part of any dynamic relationship. Even in the best of intention, conflict can happen, right? Right? That's really true. However, violent conflict is a choice. While conflict is normal, violence is a choice. When Paul reminds the early Christians to live out the fruit of the Spirit, I don't think he meant living a perfect life, if ever there's such a term as perfection. I think Paul just wanted the early Christians to be mindful and open to the inner working of the Spirit, whose presence manifests in having to bear such spiritual fruit. Paul here affirms the belief that we continue to become a blessing to others when we allow God to cause us to bear fruit that naturally comes as we remain in the Holy Spirit through the Spirit's infilling and manifestation in our lives. To end our morning reflection, while we do acknowledge that we ourselves are not immune to internal problems, because we do have our share of creative tensions within our homes, in our workplace, even within our circles of friends. However, let us not be defined by these conflicts. Rather, let us turn these into a catalyst to become the kind of community that God calls us to be. Let us not be defined by the political rhetoric of this current administration when it comes to minority groups, when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to people coming in applying for political asylum status, when it comes to refugees who are forced to live their home communities because their safety and security are being jeopardized. Let us not be defined by the limitations and the indifference that this current administration is extending and showing to the whole world. But rather, let us turn this into a catalyst to become the kind of faith community that God calls us to be. Let the fruit of the Spirit flow freely through us. And I do believe that grace abounds as we continue to care for and nurture one another. Sometimes this is where we might need to separate ourselves from the powers that be. Grace is at work as we continue to recognize, accept, and celebrate every human being, including God's created order. And also celebrating even our government leaders and politicians whom we may not actually like, but they too are human beings. This is another challenge for us Christians. How can we extend grace to people we hate?
Jesus said so.
Oh my God. Whew, it's difficult to be a Christian. But then grace is at work as we continue to recognize, accept, and celebrate every human being, including God's created order. And as we strengthen our commitment to stand on our faith and our solidarity with one another, this to me is grace in action. Blessings, everyone. Amen.
Thank you.